The Tom Woods Show, episode 514.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Inbox Dollars pays you for playing online games, for taking surveys, for searching the web, even for redeeming coupons. Get a $5 sign-up bonus when you join through tomwoods.com/inbox. Welcome back for another episode of the show. I am starting off your week in a very strange kind of way, on a bizarre note. If you're keeping up with these episodes every single day, you are starting off this Monday morning thinking about, of all people, Henry Kissinger. But very important for us to think about and know about him because of the role he's played in U.S. foreign policy during the latter half of the 20th century. And joining us to talk about Henry Kissinger is Greg Grandin, who is author of a brand new book, Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman. Greg Grandin is professor of history at New York University. He's been published widely. You can read him in The Nation, The New York Times, Harper's, the London Review of Books, also TomDispatch.com. I'm going to be linking on today's show notes page, tomwoods.com/514, to an article that originally appeared there. It was then picked up at the AmericanConservative.com on Kissinger's work in the Middle East and his influence in the Middle East and how that continues to have an effect down to this very day. Professor Grandin also holds a PhD from Yale University, and you can visit him at greggrandin.com. We'll link to that as well at tomwoods.com/514. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
I've been wanting to do an episode on Kissinger. I'm on episode 514 now, so I have covered a lot of the basics. And I'd like to talk about Kissinger simply because in the community I travel in, he is viewed as an absolute monster. Whereas if I traveled in mainstream American political circles, he would be revered as a great strategist, a great theorist, a great patriot. The disconnect between these two camps is quite extraordinary, and he'd be viewed that way in the mainstream of the Republican Party and the mainstream of the Democratic Party. I have no doubt that Hillary Clinton holds him in the same regard that Ted Cruz does. It's astonishing, really, the disconnect between the way you and I would think about him and the way they think about him. Can we start there? What are your thoughts about just that?
Well, I think that, one, he's outlasted everybody. I mean, he's 92 years old. And, and in some ways, I think there's a certain kind of ritual. Things have gotten so bad. I mean, we could spend a whole show on just the insanity of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and how it's, doubling back on itself in all sorts of ways. And in some ways, I think Kissinger invokes nostalgia of a time of purpose, of gravitas, of seriousness. So I think there's something like that where you have Democrats and Republicans sidling up to him just to have their photos taken with him. And it's not just conservative Republicans, it's liberal Democrats. Samantha Power, a liberal hawk who came to fame writing books about genocide. She's Obama's ambassador to the United Nations. Last year, she was at a Red Sox-Yankee game with Kissinger. They were in windbreakers. They were bantering like there was some geopolitical Spencer and Tracy and Hepburn. It was nauseating. There's just a way in which Kissinger has he just becomes kind of hollowed out, I think, and the actual effects and consequences and catastrophes of his foreign policy just get erased.
The title of your book is Kissinger's Shadow, with the subtitle being The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman. And it seems that one of the theses here is that we're not dealing with ancient history or isolated events. We live with the consequences today. And so I do want to take a little time in a moment to talk about how Kissinger's policies in the Middle East continue to affect us today. But before we do that, I want to hit on an issue that comes up a lot in my libertarian circles, where Kissinger will be just offhandedly, casually referred to as a war criminal.
Yeah.
What do people have in mind when they specifically, what types of things that he advocated would make it legitimate to call him that?
Well, I think there's a long list of things, but I think many of those things could be justified. I wouldn't justify it by reasons of state and realpolitik. But there are a couple of things that go beyond that. One, he and Nixon, he was the executor, if not the architect of this, came up with an illegal double bookkeeping system in which they could bomb Cambodia, a country we weren't at war with, a sovereign country, for over a year and then continue bombing. But it was called Operation Menu. That was clearly illegal. That entailed burning documents, substituting target, so they could continue to account for munitions and fuel and spare parts, and not let Congress know that we were actually dropping the bombs on Cambodia. False reports were filed that made it look like we were bombing South Vietnam. I think that's one very specific thing. Another would be his involvement in Chile, and not so much the overthrow of Salvador Allende in 1973, but his involvement in the murder in 1970 of a constitutionalist general, Rene Snyder, who was part of the CIA's plan to kidnap him and force a constitutional crisis that might prevent Allende from being inaugurated. That Kissinger's hands were all over that. A lot of the other stuff are just run-of-the-mill atrocities, the supporting dictatorships in Latin America, giving the green light to Suharto to invade East Timor, expediting Pakistan's 1971 genocide in Bangladesh. These are all just some of the other atrocities. But I think maybe Cambodia and Chile are the ones where there's most, not just that he acted as a brutal realist or realpolitik, but that he actually broke the law.
Okay, because in these other cases, like Indonesia, for example, if the U.S. green lights something, it's not the same thing as the U.S. actually perpetrating it. Right.
Although he did, although there was a congressional law that you couldn't use U.S. Weapons for a country that was committing an aggressive military act, such as what Indonesia was doing in East Timor, and Kissinger knowingly played with the paperwork in order to make sure the arms kept flowing, and the same thing with Pakistan. So in some ways, even though those are more traditional kind of realpolitik actions, and in which we were just giving the go-ahead to our proxies, there was still, I think, you can make the case that there were illegal activities involved for that to happen.
Now, you've been using the term realpolitik, so let's say something about his overall strategy. When he approaches the world, what does he see and what does he want to see?
Well, I use the term realpolitik and realism, and that's how Kissinger is often described. And often that kind of realism is juxtaposed against the idealism or the adventurism or the arrogance of the neoconservatives who drove us into Afghanistan and Iraq and imagined themselves leading a global crusade against Islam and for democracy. I think that's a misrecognition of Kissinger. I think it is true, and we could talk about it, that there were political differences between neoconservatives like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Kissinger. But there was a good deal of overlap in how they see the world. Kissinger was very much, if you go back to his early writings as an undergraduate and then forward throughout his career, Kissinger was very much influenced not by realism and not by a realpolitik doctrine, but by a form of subjective idealism associated with a kind of strand of continental philosophy in Europe that we think of associated with Nietzsche, a kind of will to power, subjectivism, irrationalism. But in Kissinger's case, it really came straight from Oswald Spengler, a German historian that was a functional, philosophical equivalent of Nietzsche. Kissinger doesn't believe that we have access to reality, that he believes that we create our understanding of reality through our actions. And this is where he becomes a kind of philosopher of the deed. We have to constantly act in the world to come to an awareness of our power, to come to an awareness of our interests. And in the book, I try to show how that is, it's not just specific to Kissinger. It taps into a deep strand of American thought, American exceptionalism, American militarism that is constantly driving the U.S. outward.
Let's shift to the Middle East now, and there are two countries that you focus a lot of attention on, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And of course, they are still very much at the center of U.S. preoccupations in the Middle East. So let's start with Iran. Now, the traditional narrative here that people who favor a different kind of Middle Eastern foreign policy will relate is that we had the U.S. being very supportive of the Shah in Iran and being involved in the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh, and we know this story. It goes down to 1979, from 1953 to 1979. Now, there was recently an article over at National Review, and I don't read National Review. I did when I was a kid, and I grew out of it, or it grew out of me, or I don't know what happened, but somebody sent me this, and the point of this article was to say, look, you leftists who don't like American policy, what's wrong with you is you don't understand that the Shah was really no worse than a lot of other dictators you might think of, and in some ways he was better. He promoted women's rights, he built infrastructure, he built schools, he spread literacy, he was even friendly to Israel, he had robust economic growth during his time, and yeah, okay, he had his brutality, but 100 political executions over the course of the 1970s is nothing compared to a lot of the regimes of the 20th century, whereas under the Islamic Republic, we had in the first 5 years 7,900 political executions, and the most common word associated with being in one of the Shah's prisons was boredom, whereas you're not bored in a prison in the Islamic Republic. So what is your response? Because in other words, what they're saying is this morality play that we engage in is overblown because the Shah was not really so bad.
Well, I mean, I don't really think it's useful to think of who's bad, like to engage in that kind of ranking. I think it's more important to understand cause and effect and how history unfolds and how actions in one year might lead to consequences in another. Kissinger, yes, the U.S. supported the Shah since 1953, since it installed him on the peacock throne in working in conjunction with the British intelligence. But it really wasn't 1972 as the United States was trying to figure out its post-Vietnam strategy. And it was Kissinger that decided to turn to the Shah and to Saudi Arabia as what James Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense under Nixon and Ford, and called the guardians of the Gulf. And it was Kissinger who gave to the Shah what no other country in the world had, and that was the ability to buy whatever he wanted from the U.S. defense industry. I mean, there was a number of reasons for this. One was the security concerns and drawing the U.S. so very close to Iran. The other was the rising petrodollars. What are you going to do with all of that money? And people, Kissinger and others, thought it was a solution that you could recycle those petrodollars into the defense industry, which was on the ropes a little bit because of the coming Vietnam drawdown. So in some ways, that the arms race that went on and continues to go on in the Middle East really begins in 72, 73. Kissinger worked out the same exact deal with Saudi Arabia. So that rhyme, and in terms of the Shah not being that repressive, I don't think that that's true. Again, I'm sure the Ayatollahs are horrible. I'm sure I wouldn't want to be in a prison Ayatollah. I'm not a fan of any kind of religion, but I think that to be tortured under the terms of secular modernism is still torture. And I think that Savak, the intelligence service that Kissinger and the U.S. began to support and build up, was brutal and repressive, and it shut down any path to a kind of more middle-of-the-road democratization. It creates the polarization by evaporating the middle ground. We saw that over and over again in Latin America, in Southern Africa. You embolden the brutal men in these countries, and then you don't have a kind of more center, kind of moderate. And look at the Middle East, and I think that you could trace that back to Kissinger's policies, not just Iran, but Saudi Arabia.
I seem to recall hearing somebody make the point that because political opposition was suppressed and opposing ideas were suppressed, but given that he didn't dare invade the mosques, political opposition naturally then shifts to the mosques because that's where you can be opposed to him. And so there is this tendency then to have opposition rally around Islam, and to, in other words, to forge this type of opposition to the regime.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that there's You evaporate, you eliminate secular modernists, you eliminate the humanists, you eliminate the more pluralistic religious folks like they did in Latin America, and what you have is the extremists, right? That's all that's left, and I think that's what happened. But it wasn't just in Iran. I want to stress that Kissinger was instrumental at building up Pakistan's ISI, its security services, and encouraging them to go into Afghanistan after the 75 pro-Soviet coup in Afghanistan. When we think about blowback from Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen, we tend to focus on the 1980s and 1979 Soviet invasion, and the 1980s, and all of what the CIA was doing in Afghanistan. But in a lot of ways, that infrastructure was put into place by Kissinger. It was Kissinger who urged Pakistan to go into Afghanistan in 75, 76, and of course it was Kissinger's alliance with the House of Saud, with Wahhabism. So it's not any one thing that Kissinger did, but he certainly created the infrastructure of blowback in the 1970s that would come to full fruition in the 80s and then more recently.
Saudi Arabia is the other major pillar in his approach to the Middle East. How does it fit into this picture then, and how does it fit in today?
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, Kissinger, once he worked out the arms deal with Iran, in which, it would be we could go into the hundreds of planes and tanks and the billions of dollars the Shah of Iran spent on U.S. defense industry. He basically worked out the same deal with Saudi Arabia. And obviously, Saudi Arabia didn't have a revolution. They pretty much stayed, and that rock solid alliance that Washington has had with Saudi Arabia since the 1970s has been untouchable, and they continue to buy billions of dollars of arms every year. In fact, the New York Times just had a report about how the arms race is heating up, and so Kissinger today, when he comes out against the Iranian deal, he talks about how this may kick off a nuclear arms race between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. But in some ways, the terms of that arms race was put into place by Kissinger in the 1970s.
Greg, let's take just a moment for this message. All right, so I'm interested in finding out ways to earn money online. Well, here's a really easy one. Inbox Dollars actually pays you for watching videos, for playing online games, for taking surveys, even for redeeming coupons. So that's right, you get the value of the coupon, plus they pay you for getting the value of the coupon. Plus they'll give you a $5 sign-up bonus just for existing. So you'll want to sign up through tomwoods.com/inbox and get that $5 bonus. And by the way, they pay you in cash, not in points. Ooh, I accumulated 1 billion points. What does that get me? You find out it's a pack of gum. They pay you in cash for doing things you're doing anyway. Check it out at tomwoods.com/inbox. Yeah, all right, so let's bring it up to the present now. Are we being unfair to Kissinger to say that policies that he signed off on or forged in the 1970s are in some way at the heart of the current Middle East or some of our current problems? Or is this a legitimate conclusion? And can you trace it out? Can you connect the dots?
Yeah. So the point of my book is not to blame everything on Kissinger. In some ways, there's a kind of counterintuitive thing that I'm doing where I'm focusing intently on Kissinger to go beyond Kissinger. Charles Beard, a great historian in the 1930s, said that Americans tend to have a devil's theory of war. They want to blame war on one bad, wicked person or one bad, wicked group. I don't think that if you extracted Kissinger from American history, we'd have a virtuous republic. I think there are deep structural issues at play in U.S. militarism and expansionism. I think looking at Kissinger helps reveal. I think that he is responsible for all of the reasons that we talked about. The other thing that's useful about Kissinger is what we started the show with, the misrecognition of Kissinger, how he gets away with with any blame or consequence. I think, again, the point is not just to blame Kissinger, but to think about that memory hole that the U.S. has, why there is something about America's political culture that won't allow it to acknowledge the fact of blowback, that that actions that we took in the past might have consequences for today's crisis, and that subsequently things that we do today might create new forms of blowback in the future. I think, and with the thing about Kissinger and the thing about that philosophy of history and that intense subjectivism that I talked about earlier, is Kissinger explicitly rejects looking at history as cause and effect. He thinks that if you look at history as cause and effect, you could look at history as analogy. You could look at Neville Chamberlain in 1939 and talk about appeasement. You could look at Iraq and think, and analogize it to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. But that's one way of looking about history. And according to Kissinger, that's the only way we should look at history. If you look at history as blowback, as a series of causes and effects, then great statesmen will become paralyzed. They'll become fearful. They won't be able to act in the present. So, for instance, when Dick Cheney does interviews and they say, well, don't you bear some responsibility for ISIS and Syria and what's going on now, and don't you, what you did in 2003? When Cheney says, look, we can debate what we did in 2002, 2003, whether it's right or wrong, but there's a crisis today and we have to respond to it. That's pure Kissingerism. I'm not saying that he read Kissinger and came up with that but it taps into a deep kind of denialism. One of the central aspects of American exceptionalism is invoking history, right? We are historically the world's greatest country, and a denial of history, especially history that is understood as cause and effect. And Kissinger, throughout his career, has explicitly denied and insisted that we shouldn't look at history as cause and effect, as a chain of events that lead to the present, because that's paralyzing. That will prevent us from, that will stop us from that will be so fearful of yesterday's catastrophe repeating itself, we won't be able to take bold action today to confront the current crisis, even if the current crisis was caused by yesterday's actions. So that's one of the reasons why I think Kissinger is worth looking at.
I'm glad you said that it's a problem in American political culture, and that, again, we're not trying to put all this, as the responsibility of Kissinger individually, because this whole American exceptionalism thing is just paralyzing for moral analysis, because you've got Mitt Romney writing a book called, I think it was called No Apology. Yeah. Now, I'll admit, I didn't read that book. And I generally have a policy that I don't criticize books I haven't read. But I think with Mitt Romney, I'm going to make one exception in the past 20 years. Because I pretty much know what that book is about, right? We're going to bomb and do whatever we want. And to heck with it, because we're Americans and you're towelheads. And don't tell me that we've made mistakes in the but you know what? They'll use this antiseptic word, mistakes. Yeah. Mistakes in the passive voice. Mistakes were made. They're always mistakes. They're not crimes. They're not atrocities. They're mistakes. And the whole culture has, I mean, I think that's much worse, probably because of 9/11, but I think it's much worse than it was back in, even in the heart of the Cold War. Yeah. I don't think people were going up saying thank you for your service and saluting when people are in uniform on an airplane, or the military got 10% off at the ice cream store. It's just totally off the rails now.
Every time you fly into another airport, you want to donate this to the, this or the veterans. And I mean, I know it's the militarization of everyday life in the U.S. is pretty intense, and that's part of the amnesia. War is made possible by amnesia, and then war deepens the amnesia. I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, it's Romney, it's Dick Cheney's book, The Exceptionals, or whatever it's called, Exceptional. And
yet, you know what else though? Even Hillary Clinton. Yeah. She's leading in the polls among the Democrats, and for some reason, I think there are still some Republicans who think she's an anti-war wimp. Yeah, she's against all the wars that are not fashionable anymore. Yeah. But she's always in favor of today's war, tomorrow's war, and the war after that. And this is why I was very let down, but I have to say not entirely surprised, that Bernie Sanders didn't rip her head off for this stuff. I mean, he should have come out swinging and said, you are the opposite of what I stand for.
Well, I think that's right. I think Hillary's more embedded in the national security state. I mean, when they asked who her enemies were, and she said Iran. I mean, where did that come from? A nation of 50 million people are her enemies. I mean, but aside from that, I think that I agree with you. I think Bernie Sanders' foreign policy is dangerous. One might think that it's more calculated. He's just made a decision that this is not going to be an issue, and he's not going to, he's going to shut down any debate. He's not going to come off as a wimp, but he's not. I don't know if Sanders is as invested in the national security state, but maybe that's not true. I think that he voted. He voted to authorize and the reauthorize funding for Iraq.
Oh yeah, and he voted for the F-35, which the F-35 is the biggest boondoggle ever.
I know, and that's not made in Vermont, is it? I mean, this is
that's the only thing I could think is that this is his ethanol or something, but I don't think it is. Although those SOBs try and spread out the building of these things to as many districts as they can, so as to rope in as many congressmen as possible.
They can build up domestic support. I mean, this is one of the things that happens under Nixon and Kissinger, in which militarism becomes completely subordinated to domestic interests, either using militarism to kind of get political leverage as domestic politics polarize. Nixon's constantly sending Kissinger out to the West Coast to tell Ronald Reagan that that it's or Bob Hope or these movement conservatives that it actually does make a difference that it's Nixon and not Humphrey in the White House, because we wouldn't have had Laos, we wouldn't have had Cambodia. There was a way in which foreign policy becomes blood tribute as a way of holding together a domestic coalition in the U.S. And I think obviously that has deep roots in the U.S. going back before Nixon and Kissinger, but Kissinger and Nixon really do take it to a new level, I think.
I know we're coming up on the end here, but I hope you'll let me ask you one Vietnam question related to Kissinger, just because we touched on it very, very briefly. But at the end of the Vietnam War, I mean, let's say 1975, when the North is completely victorious, there are people who would say, well, they say two things. First, Nixon in his own book, No More Vietnams, claims that there was a difference in the terms that were on the table in 1968 and the terms that were eventually accepted later on, 5 years later. And he says that basically it was that originally we had to remove our own ally in the South, whereas we were allowed to keep that regime in place under the different terms of the 70s, and that's better. But of course the problem was you also accepted the principle that the North Vietnamese could hold their positions in the South, which is rather hard to deal with. Yeah. But what I would hear people saying, though, is that if in 1975 the Congress had been willing to authorize some use of air power, then that could have been reversed. And so this is not a matter of just a stupid policy. It was just that it was a limp-wristed Congress.
Well, Larry Berman in his book No Peace, No Honor makes the argument that the 73 peace accords were actually designed to fail and to prove that North Vietnam was the aggressor, and this way Nixon and Kissinger could have gone to Congress and they could have gone full on in terms of the bombing of North Vietnam and with no holds barred. They would basically have a warrant. Berman argues that Watergate interrupted that if it wasn't that Watergate basically derailed that plan. But he makes a fairly compelling case that the 73 peace accords were designed by Nixon and Kissinger to fail, and with the sense that they would then have a warrant to do whatever they want, which they didn't have prior to that. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but
right. But do you think? I mean, if that were true, this is then a case of totally miscalculating the feelings of the country at that point.
Right, and obviously not foreseeing what would happen with Vietnam. I mean, with Watergate. And by the way, it needs to be said, and this is something that I try to draw out in the book, is that Watergate wasn't a domestic scandal. It's remembered as a domestic scandal, but it was really about Cambodia. It was about the intense paranoia that spread over the White House through that secret bombing of Cambodia, because they were afraid of the public backlash that led Kissinger and Nixon and Haldeman and Ehrlichman and all of these, guys to take all of the illegal actions that would eventually lead to Watergate. And the first articles of impeachment filed against Nixon was about the illegal war in Cambodia, but a coalition of a majority of conservative Democrats and Republicans got together and basically made the impeachment about the domestic part of Watergate. So you could draw a line. So
wow,
yeah,
even I didn't quite realize that there are foreign policy connections even here.
There's a chain of events. So the way it happens is that Kissinger conspires with Nixon to derail the peace talks in '68 to get Nixon elected. Once Nixon is elected, they have to restart the peace talks. So the only way they can do that, because they can't start bombing North Vietnam for political reasons, is that they start bombing Cambodia. The bombing of Cambodia they have to do in secret. That secrecy creates this intense paranoia and state of siege within the White House. When Daniel Ellsberg releases the Pentagon Papers, which has nothing to do with the Nixon administration, it ends in '68 with Johnson. Kissinger is afraid that Ellsberg has sources in the National Security Council that he knows what's going on in Cambodia. So Kissinger gets Nixon all cranked up about the need to basically take down Ellsberg. So they establish the plumbers. The plumbers break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist office. They also break into Watergate. So there's a direct kind of, I'm talking about not wanting to look at history as a series of chain causes and effects, but it's that '68 plotting in which Kissinger passes information about the peace talks off to Nixon not only launches his public career, but kicks off that chain of events that leads to Watergate.
That is really, really interesting. So it goes to show, yet again, the domestic consequences of the empire.
Yeah, exactly. It's
very, very easy to overlook that.
And the way that Watergate is transformed into a domestic scandal and the foreign policy dimensions of it, the militarism, is erased from that history.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing.
Boy, I'll tell you, historians like you have your work cut out for you to try to take the stuff that's been erased and unerase it. You get that white out off of that piece of paper.
Yeah.
Anyway, give us a 60-second pitch for because it's, as you know, when you write a book, you have all the competition in the world. Yeah. Every title in the world is implicitly against you. So why should people pick up a copy? I'll link to it at tomwoods.com/514 for convenience. Why should people pick up a copy of Kissinger's Shadow?
Well, I think it's about a fascinating person, but beyond that, it links Vietnam and Cambodia to today's endless war. It reveals the deeper history of today's endless war and all-pervasive security state. And Andrew Basovich calls it a great book in the back and as a blurb. So that reason alone.
That's right. Well, his testimony means quite a bit to me, and I hope to my listeners as well. Well, definitely we want to check out Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman. Again, linking to it at tomwoods.com/514. You have your own website, greggrandin.com, and I will link to that on our show notes page as well. Well, Greg, thanks so much for your time today. Tremendous work you're doing, and I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tom. It was really, really great conversation. A lot of fun.
All right. If that discussion whetted your appetite for Greg Grandin's book, Kissinger's Shadow, you can get it on today's show notes page, tomwoods.com/514, and it'll be waiting for you there. And remember, if you're going to take that plunge into blogging, don't do so without first visiting tomwoods.com/publicity. I got a great deal for you. I'll publicize your blog for nothing. Plus, I got all kinds of tutorials and everything that'll get you up and running in no time flat and make you an expert if that's what you want to be. So check it out, tomwoods.com/publicity. More great stuff coming the rest of this week. See you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.